It's a small crowd, but it's a select crowd. We're very happy that each and every one of you that are here and can hear our speakers today. My name is Diane Bruxvoort. I'm the Associate Dean for Scholarly Resources and Research Services in the libraries. With that title, this is a very appropriate place for me to be today. I think these exhibits are definitely part of our scholarly resources. This is a slightly unusual exhibit that we have over in the other library. Lincoln, the Constitution and the Civil War. It's not a traditional biography of Lincoln. It's not a traditional exhibit about the Civil War, but it's about the constitutional crisis brought on by the Civil War. All the things that came together there. The severest test of the American experiment in popular self-government since the founding of the Republic. Lincoln understood this and met the challenge, and that's what the exhibit is about. So this is part of our programming in support of the exhibit. So we're glad you're here, and I get the pleasure of introducing our speakers for today. I'm going to introduce both of our speakers, and then they will speak in that order that I introduced them. Dr. Patricia Hilliard-Nunn, whose talk is on Prayers and Courage, African Americans and the Civil War in Alachua County, is an adjunct associate professor in the African American Studies program. She earned her doctorate in mass communication from Florida State University in 1993. She owns Macari Publishing Company and works as an independent media producer. Her areas of research include media and culture, audience analysis, enslaved Africans in Alachua County, and African American history in Alachua County. Her creative practices include media production, West African dance, and mixed media art. Before teaching in African American Studies, she taught Black women in film in the Center for Women's Studies and Gender Research at the University of Florida, and served various populations while working as a community organizer in Alachua County. Dr. Sharon Austin, whose talk is entitled The Influence of Abraham Lincoln on President Barack Obama, is Associate Professor of Political Science and the Interim Director of the African American Studies program here at the University of Florida. Her teaching interests are in American government, urban politics, and minority politics. Her first book, Race, Power, and Political Emergence in Memphis, was published in 2000 by Garland Publishing. Her second book, The Transformation of Plantation Politics in the Mississippi Delta, Black Politics, Concentrated Poverty, and Social Capital in the Mississippi Delta, was published by the State University of New York Press in 2006. Currently, excuse me, she is completing her third book, I have to work at this one, The Caribbeanization of Black Politics, Race, Group Consciousness, and Political Participation in America. Please join me in welcoming our speakers today.
Well, good morning, troopers. Thank you. Happy to see you here. And I want to thank the library for doing this, pulling this grant together, bringing this exhibit here, and putting this outstanding schedule together. And I want to thank you for inviting me, and especially want to thank my friend now, and a major helper to our department, Ms. Jana over there. And I just have to do a few things to make sure I set. Oh, there it is. Okay. It worked a second ago. We have an image? All right, okay. All right, I'm going to watch my time here. Dr. Austin, if you could kind of yell out at about... I can be long-winded, and I didn't remove those slides that I was supposed to, but I'm going to move through this rather quickly. I want to just quickly say that this is based on another presentation that I gave, which is actually based on another presentation that I gave, that focuses on the history of enslaved laborers in Alachua County, which is the area that I focus on. But what I've done is try to bring forth some of the information about the ways that African Americans were involved during the Civil War, There will be a lot of talk about who fought, whom, when, where, why the Civil War started. I'm not going to get into that today, okay? Because I don't know, it might turn into a big fight. But hopefully I'll share some things that are new to you. I also want to just clarify one thing. I'm actually a full-time lecturer in African American Studies now. I wouldn't say that, but now that they're working me to death, I need to make that just 8:30 classes. So I'm claiming it. But thank you very much. Just what I'm going to do quickly is give you a little background leading up to the Civil War, and then I'm going to talk about what those whispered prayers are and what the courageous acts were leading up there. For starters, I want to point out that in 1860, before the Civil War, 54% of the people living in Alachua County were African people. Most of those people were enslaved. By 1870, 87% of those people were African American, right here in Alachua County. And then, of course, in 2010, started to go down. That first statistic, the 54% statistic, is what piqued my interest in looking at the history of blacks in Alachua County. When I would read books, I never learned anything about those people. They would talk about the Civil War, people would talk about Alachua County history, Gainesville history, but they would never mention the African American population. And so I said, well, how do you leave half of the population out of the narrative? So since that time, I've learned that there are many stories to tell. I've gathered many oral histories, collected a lot of information over the time, and so I just want to share this so that you all will continue to dig. And also to let you know, I got a lot of the information right here at the library. Okay, and I will just start also by pointing out that this man here, Josiah T. Walls, who fought for the Union, was the second elected mayor of Gainesville, Florida. And so he moved here after the war. One of his leaders, commanders, Cessna, encouraged him to settle in Alachua County where he settled. And so they settled here together and worked. He also became a congressman. He owned over 1,000 acres of land. He was a teacher. He was a miller. He was a newspaper owner. He was a lawyer. And the list goes on. In fact, he was the last African American to represent the state of Florida in Congress until the early 90s when Harry Meeks and Alcee Hastings were elected. Okay? So it's very significant that all of that took place before the 1900s. But he, along with many other black Union soldiers and others, settled here after the war. Background, just quickly, how did people wind up in Alachua County? Well, of course, there were already native inhabitants here. There were Africans who visited and explored the state of Florida, along with the Spanish, as explorers, as conquistadors. Some were just learning about, like Wangarido. Well, we've known tidbits, but fortunately he was trying to get paid by the Spanish crown, so we were able to learn. He wrote his own story and talked about what he did. But many different people have ruled Florida. When people came here, they had Africans with them, and some came as free people. Also, I can't begin to talk about the Civil War until you know that African Americans have fought in every war and always been promised something. Some of you have seen the film Red Tails recently, so it's no different than that. Oh, maybe now they'll believe in us. We fight, they'll believe in us. We'll be full citizens, we'll be able to vote, okay? So that was the case before. So the prayers for freedom for the African Americans in Alachua County started when their ancestors, and some of them, left the continent of Africa and were forced to across the Atlantic, brought by many different people. Most of the people who wound up in Alachua County had been enslaved in South Carolina. They'd also been enslaved in Georgia and in other places, but many of the early settlers came from South Carolina. Some of those people and some of the plantation owners some of the black plantation owners were descendants of those early Spanish people who had come to the state of Florida, particularly when you're talking about those who were left over from the time of Spanish rule. Okay? Even while this was going on, there were people all over the country doing other things. And I'm sorry to have to do this, but so many people think that when people came, they were just helpless, just enslaved. They don't realize people were working, thinking, feeling people, functioning people at that time. But they came in waves, and the key date that I want to point out here as I move quickly is that Florida became a state in 1845, but if you look down here, the Civil War started in 1861. Why is that important? It's important because it shows that those planters were in no hurry to end that period of enslavement, okay? Because they were just starting to enjoy themselves. They had moved here, the weather was great, there was lots of land available. Their friends had been here for earlier conquests or fought in other wars. They said, hey, it's great, move down. We'll give you incentives. The Armed Occupation Act. If you get people to come, if you move enslaved laborers here with you, we'll give you land, okay? So people came and they settled, and many of them did well. Some of those people you see here, David Levy Yulee, Stringfellow family, the Dudleys, there's a whole list of those early settlers, okay? I'm going to change on me. Okay, there it is. Now it's really changing. It's going crazy. But anyway, I'll go on since it has an attitude of its own now. Okay. It's alive. But anyway, you can just see a list here from the 1850 census of 112 owners who were here in Alachua County, and then next to their names you can kind of see the numbers of enslaved Africans that they had here in Alachua County. And then here's another map. Does it look like I just selected some names that are pointing to, and these lines are pointing to where some of those plantations would have been. But those people were helping to grow crops. They were domestic workers, midwives, they were cooking. In Alachua County, there were only 7 free people on the census, on the 1860 census. Okay, so when I even thought about removing that column because it's irrelevant. There weren't that many free people. So most of the people were working. People heard about the abolitionists of the day because they weren't totally isolated. They would listen out for the news. They'd listen to conversations around dinner tables to hear what was coming down the pike. And so the talk of that time leading up to the war here, there are people who share different things. I'm just going to share a little bit from this congressman from South Carolina. African slavery is the cornerstone of the industrial, social, and political fabric of the South. And whatever wars against it, wars against her very existence. And he goes on. And then closer to home, Richard Call said the institution of African slavery has become the great agency of civilization. It's feeding people, clothing people, and he goes on. People were getting antsy here because Abraham Lincoln, starting to hear this Lincoln name, and the changes were already taking place in the country. And obviously they didn't want Lincoln because they perceived him as being someone who was against who was going to close down their good thing, I say, okay? And they didn't want that to happen. And there are other stories I won't get into because some people, Lerone Bennett in particular, says they believe in many ways Lincoln was forced into glory. But I'll let you go look that one up, okay? Closer to home, John Pillow said, gentlemen of the convention, we meet together under no ordinary circumstances. The rapid spread of northern fanaticism has endangered our liberties and institutions, and the election of Abraham Lincoln, the list goes on. So basically, I'm just showing you the leaders were against what was taking place. People all over were preparing for the war to take place. When the war started, Florida was basically the breadbasket. They didn't see a lot of action here in Florida. They provided the cows, The little bit of cotton that they could provide, they didn't have much of that left. They had to round up clothes to send to the people on the lines, a little whatever food they had. So it was hard for people at home here in Alachua County when you read those letters from family members, and it was hard for the soldiers. But this is the key thing. It doesn't, ultimately, when you talk about that war, you talk about the prayers for freedom, ultimately to the African Americans, while some of them loved the owners and they had friends who were free, white friends, it was a war between two different groups of white people. All white people didn't own enslaved people, but the majority of black people in Alachua County were enslaved and didn't want to be. And then the other point, enslaved Africans welcomed the opportunity for freedom and the elimination of this system that had dehumanized so many for so long. So yes, there were whispered prayers. They were whispered because you couldn't say, ooh, Lincoln was elected, woo, ooh, because you could get killed, punished, and sent away. And I'll show you somebody who was. But people could still be sold off because when people would run out of money, owners would run out of money, they could sell people at will, and separate families when they got ready. They could rent them out, which was happening frequently. These are just some of the names of the owners here in Alachua County who rented their enslaved laborers out to help all over the state. And sometimes the state or the government demanded that they send the enslaved laborers to go and help. But they were just watching, they were listening. Sometimes the owners would move their enslaved laborers farther south, they would believe from the border. I already mentioned they would rent them out. Some people felt, ooh, we're going to be free, so they may have slacked off on work. Okay, but the key thing is they were the producers of the supplies for the Confederacy, because many of the plantation owners left. They left their wives. They left members of their family. So those were the people who were working at home, holding things down, if you will. So there were different roles during the period of the war. Some were body servants, and it wasn't just for the Confederacy that they served as body servants. They were also body servants sometimes for the Union, who treated them a little better, and we'll get to that. Working in salt mines, they continued the roles they played, but they were just a part of these different fighting groups. They were spies, they were lookouts, they were nurses. They hid the property of their owners if they heard the Union was getting closer. So it was an odd situation, you can see, because part of you wanted to be free, and you want to say, hey, over here, right? But you're looking, you're like, oh yeah, I was just watching this, but now over here, okay? So you had to be very careful. But there were runaways and who were labeled as fugitive slaves, refugees, contrabands. There were some outstanding films out now, documentaries and books that specifically address the lives of the contrabands, which is what they were called once they were captured. Okay. The courageous acts also started when people were kidnapped from those dungeons. Okay, but people rebelled. They ran away. They would have work stoppages. They'd act dumb. They'd break the tools. And they'd run to go fight for the Union. Okay? Before that, people had already been running away. There are many stories where people sending letters home. People talked, after the period of enslavement ended, they talked about reuniting with family that they had ran away from, and in some cases they fought for the Union. Some of them heard the word Frederick Douglass, but many didn't. They just ran away, like Thomas Robinson here, who was owned by Peter Sparkman, who some of you may, if you're from Alachua County, he had owned a large plantation. He was owned when he was 6, out east of where we are now. Well, he had escaped in 1864, because he knew about what was going on, and then he went and he enlisted to fight with the Union, the 21st U.S. Colored Infantry. And so we're able to know about him because he had to file for his pension. And so the son of his former, of Sparkman's son, yeah, I remember him. He was fine when he left. And at least he was nice enough to tell the truth to help him get his money. And then some other people who had been enslaved who knew him told the truth about him. So that's how we know about him. And, by the way, about many others who left and who either left Alachua County to go fight elsewhere or who wound up in Alachua County like Josiah T. Walls, okay? So this other man, Sergeant McIntyre, was owned by Governor Mosley, and this is important because everybody was not monolithic. They didn't have this monolithic character. Some were nice, some were mean. This just happened to be a person who was nice, who owned this man and allowed him to leave the plantation. Well, he was a builder, and he was one of these people who was able to make money on his own, renting himself out to other people. So what happened to him is while he was out, he got in trouble, excuse me, and he would talk too much, I say, okay? And so he got caught talking about what was going to happen. Oh, the war, you know, we're going to win, the Yankees are coming, and he told too many people, and so he had to get out of there, you see, and he had to leave his family in Micanopy, okay? So there are many stories like that. There are some, approximately 1,000 African-American soldiers fought from Florida, fought for the Union side. There are some who also fought for the Confederacy. But it's a different, that's a long story I'm not going to get into right now, okay? And we have lots of debates about that. One issue with the Confederacy is that they didn't permit African Americans to fight until it was too late. The war was almost over, so it wouldn't have made a difference. But they had many cooks, servants, body servants with them that were out there. And if you go to some of these reenactments, you'll see people who say, oh yeah, I'm my great-grandfather, and I'm proud, you know, so whatever. Union report of the first Gainesville skirmish. I love this quote that was printed in the Chelsea Telegraph and Pioneer on March 5th in 1864, because it describes the fact that the enslaved laborers here in Gainesville weren't just sitting there waiting for somebody to free them. They weren't happy to be enslaved, but when they had an opportunity, they broke loose and tried to go join the other people who were close by. In fact, they threw bales of cotton in the road to prevent the Confederates from coming into town. And then at the end of the day, they left with them. They took them with them, and then they enlisted in the army. And then there's more here. It shows people were writing. It says, among the Negroes liberated, there were several who could write fairly. One of these ex-cattle had been his master's bookkeeper, cashier, clerk, and managing man, his owner, utterly ignorant of the merest rudiments of education. And, you know, it goes on with different stories like this, so we start to learn that these people did different things. They were writing, they were reading, they were, in addition to building and planting and doing. This man, William Powell McKnight, people who are from Alachua County know of him because his family owns a church. They're the McKnight family who owned one of the Church of God in Christ out here. Actually, it's all over Alachua County. But they came down here. He had fought for the 54th. After the war, he liked it so much, he came and settled in this area, and his family came here. And I just want to go on. And then, just to show you that people knew it was getting tight, but they were still trying to get labor, and that's why people put ads and things like the Cotton State News where they said, Negroes wanted. It said they will be, they've issued an order for one Negro man out of every 4 in East Florida to work on fortifications. They were desperate. Their war was almost over. They needed help. And basically they're saying, look, either if the Negroes are not given up willingly, we presume they will be impressed. Okay. So by the time emancipation came, obviously the white citizens or the citizens who were related to the slave owners who wanted to continue the institution were not happy. And they said things like this: the Negroes around the county are starting to behave badly, as it was feared they would do. Many plantations are entirely deserted. I have told my Negroes that I expect that they will be free, but in any case, they have got to work. And it is only a question of whether they will work for me or somebody else. Now, whenever I read that, I think, now, why does she think they're surprised they've had to work? Who was doing all the work up to that time? So finally, I just want to end with this quick quote from Harriet Tubman. She said, I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person now that I was free. There was such a glory over everything. The sun came like gold through the trees and over the hills, and I felt like I was in heaven. So yes, there were definitely prayers for freedom, and there was courage. Thank you.
That's a hard act to follow. And I didn't bring a PowerPoint presentation. I just want to briefly give you some information about President Lincoln's background, his childhood, his political career, and also, of course, his assassination. But mostly today I want to talk about just some of the things that President Lincoln had in common with President Obama, because I don't know if you know this or not, but President Lincoln is someone who influenced President Obama more so than any other American president. So I want to talk about just some really interesting things that I found in doing research for this talk. Some things that they've got in common. And also I want to talk about just the overall influence that President Lincoln had on President Obama and still continues to have on his presidency. And lastly, I want to talk a little bit about the Emancipation Proclamation. It's kind of hard to say that, Emancipation Proclamation, which was issued by President Lincoln on New Year's Day in 1863, because in elementary school, I'm sure you learned that this was a proclamation that led to, I guess, the end of the institution of slavery. And in a way, that's true, but there are some things that a lot of people don't know about the emancipation that I want to kind of clarify today. But I also want to say that I'm really impressed by just this project and just the fact I'm honored that we even have this Lincoln, the Constitution, and the Civil War exhibit even here at the university, and I'm really happy to be a part of this today. So I want to talk a little bit about President Lincoln's background. He said this in his autobiography. I was born on February 12, 1809 in Hardin County, Kentucky. My parents were both born in Virginia, of undistinguished families, second families, perhaps I should say. My mother died in my 10th year, and she was from a family of the name Hanks. My father was removed from Kentucky to Indiana in my 8th year. It was a wild region with many bears and other wild animals still in the woods. There I grew up. Of course, when I came of age, I did not know much. Still, somehow, I could read, write, and cipher. I guess that means math. But that was all. So he had a really, really humble childhood in Kentucky, and that's really interesting considering the fact that his political career was most distinguished, I guess, in the state of Illinois. He wasn't actually born there. And so that's some things just about just the humble background and the childhood. He grew up very poor in Kentucky. He married Mary Todd, and they had 4 boys. Only one of his boys lived to maturity. So he had a lot of, I guess, adversity in his life because of the poverty that he was surrounded by in his childhood, and even with he and his wife, and with the deaths of 3 of their 4 sons. In 1858, you can see this was when he was first beginning his political career. He wasn't successful at first, and that's something also I forgot to mention. I'm going to mention some things about him and President Obama. This is one of the things I forgot to include that they have in common, because he lost his first, I guess, major race when he was running for political office, and the same can be said when President Obama first ran for Congress. He was unsuccessful at first. But anyway, in 1858, Abraham Lincoln ran against Stephen A. Douglas for senator, and he lost that election. But the good thing about him losing that election is, despite the fact that he didn't win, he gained a national reputation. And a lot of people were really impressed by his candidacy and were impressed by a lot of the qualities and characteristics that he had. And so that influenced him to seek the Republican nomination for president, which he then won 2 years later in 1860. As president, he built the Republican Party, and that's why even to this day we think of it as the Party of Lincoln, into a strong national organization. At the time, it was the most prominent and most dominant political party in our country. And then one of the things I'm going to mention in more detail, On January 1st, he probably is best known for issuing the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 that declared forever free those slaves within the Confederacy. And the actual language of the proclamation is that it declared, quote, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of the state, the people whereof shall be in rebellion against the United States shall be thenceforward forever free. So that's the actual language from the Emancipation Proclamation. A year later, in 1864, he won re-election. In his second inaugural address, this is something that is now inscribed on one of the walls of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. He said this, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds. So that's one of his most famous quotes. And unfortunately, approximately a year later, on Good Friday, April 14th, 1865, he was assassinated at the Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. But I'm sure you learned this a long time ago. John Wilkes Booth, who was an actor who somehow thought that President Lincoln was doing things to help the South. So that's really, I guess, the irony of it all. So President Lincoln, when you think about the reputation or the perception that we still have of him, he still continues to be known as the great emancipator, simply because he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Also, another thing that he probably is known for to a lesser extent is that he accomplished the fact that he united a very divided nation. And so Patricia Hilliard-Nunn, or my colleague, just recently talked about just some of the things that happened even here in Alachua County during the Civil War. The nation at the time was in chaos, and I mean, you know, you hear about the problems that we're experiencing now. It's nothing compared to the things that he experienced when he was president, the kind of divisions that existed at the time. So he was able to unite a divided nation, divided them along northern and southern lines, even divided and continuing among slave and free lines, and there were other divisions there as well. So that's what he pretty much is still continuing to be known for, and that's what his legacy continues to be. So when you think about Abraham Lincoln and Barack Obama, what exactly do they have in common? First of all, neither man was born in the state of Illinois. As I just mentioned, Abraham Lincoln was born in Kentucky, and as you know, I guess, well, it's hard to say President Obama hears so much about his birth, but he was born, although a lot of people don't believe this, he was born in Hawaii, Honolulu, Hawaii. So even though neither man was born in Illinois, they both had distinguished political careers in the state of Illinois. One other interesting thing, President Obama was born in 1961, and that was 100 years after Abraham Lincoln became president in 1861. So that's really, you know, an ironic sort of coincidence that during that 100-year period, the president was born in 1961, Abraham Lincoln was first inaugurated in 1861. Both of them were criticized for being too inexperienced to be president. As you know, with President Obama, he still, I guess, hears that criticism. Abraham Lincoln heard the same criticism when he first ran for president. And as you know, President Obama was a state senator in the state of Illinois for a few years, and then later he only served in the U.S. Senate for approximately 18 months before deciding to run for president. Abraham Lincoln also served in the Illinois legislature briefly. He only served a single term in Congress, so both of them didn't really have a lot of experience in terms of holding office before they decided to run for president. President Obama, another thing they have in common, was inaugurated, as you know, in 2009. Abraham Lincoln was born 200 years earlier in 1809. So that, again, is another, I guess, kind of really ironic coincidence. Another thing that's interesting about both men is that they were both raised by women other than their mothers, because I just mentioned the fact that Abraham Lincoln's mother died when he was 10 years old. President Obama was raised by his mother, but also his grandmother as well. So Abraham Lincoln was mostly raised by his stepmother. President Obama was raised by his mother, but also mostly by his grandmother as well. So that's another thing they have in common. Also, President Lincoln, who, as you know, is a Republican, President Obama, as you know, is a Democrat, both of them were relatively young when they became president. Abraham Lincoln was only 51, President Obama was only 47, so that's considered to be really young to be, I guess, an American president. And then lastly, both of them were presidents during times of great crisis. As you know, some of the problems that we're dealing with now economically in our country, the financial crisis and also the wars that President Obama has had to deal with. Abraham Lincoln was preoccupied with the Civil War and other divisions as well. So both of them came into office during a time when there was a lot of crisis. So both of them had a lot to really overcome. And it was very difficult, especially considering the fact that both of them didn't really have a lot of experience. So what influence overall has Abraham Lincoln had on President Obama. President Obama, I guess even now, continues to refer to the influence of President Lincoln. He uses a lot of quotes that President Lincoln used in the past, and he also, I guess, has looked to President Lincoln's presidency as a way, I guess, to model his own, as a way to sort of lead Americans during a time of crisis. So that probably was the greatest influence President Lincoln has had on him and continues to have on his presidency. But one thing that was interesting, when President Obama announced his candidacy, he announced it in Springfield, Illinois, which was President Lincoln's former home. So I guess that is also another thing. And he really made it clear, even when he announced that he was running for president in February 2007, that he had a lot of admiration for Abraham Lincoln. He referred to him several times when he was making his announcement. For example, this is one of the quotes from the February 7th, 2007 announcement, in which President Obama said, "Abraham Lincoln had his doubts, he had his defeats, he had his setbacks, but through his will and his words, he moved a nation and helped free a people. It is because of the millions who rallied to his cause that we are no longer divided, north and south, slave and free." So that's one of the things that President Obama wanted to do. I guess you can debate whether or not he's been successful in trying to bring together a divided nation that no longer is divided in the same way as it was during President Lincoln's time, but I guess now we have more partisan divisions and other types of divisions. And he wanted to be the person who would come in and I guess be the great healer. A lot of people would argue that he hasn't really succeeded at that, but that was one of the things that he was influenced by with President Lincoln. In 2009, when President Obama was giving his inauguration speech, the theme of the 2009 inauguration was "A New Birth of Freedom," and that was taken directly from President Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, in which he also talked about a new birth of freedom. So again, President Obama is showing his admiration for President Lincoln. He also took the presidential oath of office on Lincoln's Bible. I don't know if you guys watched this or if you remember seeing this when the First Lady was holding a Bible that was once owned by former President Lincoln, and President Obama took his oath of office on that particular Bible. Another thing, another influence that President Lincoln had on President Obama is, as I mentioned, some of the most recent famous quotes that President Obama has used were also quotes that are very, very similar to those used by Abraham Lincoln. For example, Abraham Lincoln once promised, quote, "to bind up the nation's wounds," unquote. And he also said, and I'm sure you might have heard this quote, "a house divided against itself cannot stand." President Obama, in 2008, when he was accepting the Democratic nomination, he said this, and I'm sure you might have heard of this quote as well, "There's not a liberal America and a conservative America, there is the United States of America. There's not a black America and a white America and a Latino America and an Asian America, there's the United States of America." So a lot of people have seen, I guess, sort of a connection between those two quotes, and they think that they're very similar. But the last thing I want to talk about, because I know you probably have a lot of questions for us, is the Emancipation Proclamation. And that's another thing, I guess, that they have in common is kind of a connection between the two men. President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. President Obama, as you know, is the first African-American president. So he issued a proclamation that led to, I guess, the end of the institution of slavery. And now you have an African-American who is now the first African-American president of the United States. And so when President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, I guess in elementary school you probably learned that this was something that led to, I guess, the slaves being freed. And I guess to some extent there is a lot of truth to that, but really in reality, if you really do any research, presidential historians have pointed out that really the Emancipation Proclamation didn't really free any slaves at the time it was issued in 1863. Now, it did eventually lead to the end of the institution of slavery, but it didn't really end slavery in the way that we were taught when we were children, in the way, I guess, that we would assume. And actually, President Lincoln didn't have the legal grounds, or he didn't have the legal authority to really end the institution of slavery, because this was something that had to be done by constitutional amendment. But as a result of him issuing the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, 2 years later, in 1865, the 13th Amendment was ratified to the U.S. Constitution, and it says, quote unquote, "neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the parties shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction." So in other words, the 13th Amendment pretty much ended slavery. And if it had not been for President Lincoln's, I guess, his support of the end of the institution of slavery, maybe this amendment would never have been ratified to the Constitution. So I guess in a way, he might not really be it's not fair really to think of him as the great emancipator, but nevertheless, I guess it all depends on how you perceive him. But I guess nevertheless, he was a shrewd politician because he made it very clear that he was against the institution of slavery, and it could even be argued that he was the first anti-slavery president ever to be elected. So he did in the end succeed in getting what he wanted, which was the end or the termination of the institution of slavery, but it wasn't necessarily through the Emancipation Proclamation, it was through the 13th Amendment. So I'll just go ahead and end there, and then if you have any questions, just let us know. Thank you.
Questions? Floor is open, now is your opportunity. Sir?
So in 1863, he did the Emancipation Proclamation and then ran for re-election in the Republican Party in 1864. I was wondering, how did the Emancipation Proclamation affect his election, and who was he running against? Like, what was the margin of victory for him in '64?
Okay, he was re-elected in 1864, and the main reason why he was re-elected was not necessarily because of the end of the institution of slavery or because of his position on slavery, but because he was able to unite the nation and bring together the North and the South and bring back the southern states that had seceded from the nation. So as far as the margin of victory, I'm not really sure, but that's the main reason why. It's because he was seen as a person who was the great unifier who brought together a divided nation.